In 1812, Napoleon, Emperor of France, controlled almost all of Europe. But Tsar Alexander of Russia was not supporting Napoleon's continental blockade of Great Britain. And so the Emperor invaded Russia with a massive army of 450,000 men.
The world has never seen an army like that before. Never. I mean, 450,000 men. I mean, you read about these things in the ancient times, but we know that those are just fiction. That's fiction.
On June 23, 1812, Napoleon crossed the Neman River into Russia, expecting to launch a quick assault and gain a victory before summer ended. But to Napoleon's surprise and dismay, the Russian army seemed to melt away, retreating into the countryside, and the French followed in pursuit. Before long, the harsh reality of the campaign began to sink in. The heat of the summer was unbearable. Food was scarce. Disease rampant.
By the time they've gone 100 miles, you've lost maybe 70 or 80,000 troops have just marched off and said, the hell with it.
Finally, in early September, the French force, now reduced to slightly more than 100,000, reached Moscow. But still, there was no victory. The Russians burned the city rather than hand it to the French. And in the ashes, Napoleon waited for 5 long weeks for the Russians to surrender. The Tsar would not give in.
And on the 13th of October, something hits him on the head and he puts his hand out. It's snow. So the next day he stops all supplies coming into Moscow. He begins to send wounded troops out of Moscow, and he begins making plans to withdraw.
During the retreat, one of the most pivotal battles came within a week after leaving Moscow, as the army moved south toward a town called Slavets. As the French soldiers approached, they learned that the area was occupied by the Russian army. A battle was inevitable. In the end, 7,000 French were dead, 6,500 Russians. The French claimed victory, but Napoleon faced a decision. Should his troops push through the waiting Russian army and continue south, or turn back to follow the same road they used for the invasion?
And there was big discussion among 4 or 5 of the major generals, and they decided they better go back on the road they came in on.
It was a critical decision. The winter would surely be more severe along the northern route, and supplies almost impossible to find. They looked ahead to the next city that might offer safety. It was Vilnius, a march of more than 3 weeks. By early December, as they approached the city, they had been walking for almost 2 months. The expectation was that in Vilnius their troubles would end. Nothing was farther from the truth. On December 6th, the temperature dropped to 36 below zero. It said that 3/4 of the army froze to death that night. The road to Vilnius was literally littered with bodies.
I mean, how do you deal with 10 below, 15 below zero day after day? And how do you do that when you don't have food? I mean, and no shelter. Live out there in 10 below, 15 below zero. How long can you last like that?
In the early days of December, Vilnius had become a magnet for tens of thousands of soldiers and refugees scattered to the east. And over the course of several days, as many as 40,000 people descended on the city. Chaos took over. The soldiers were out of control, gorging and drinking themselves into a stupor. The residents of Vilnius locked their doors, and the streets began to fill with bodies. As fate would have it, just 6 months before, at the beginning of the campaign, the soldiers had dug their own graves. An order was given, and the city was cleared of the corpses.